Most people believed the night belonged to the attacker until the weak American soldiers on Okinawa started killing enemies who were absolutely certain they were invisible. For decades, darkness had been the safest armor in war. No artillery, no rifle, no doctrine had ever taken that advantage away. And then, in April 1945, Japanese infiltration units began collapsing in silence, shot by men they could not see, track, or understand. When U.S. officers finally examined what was happening, they didn't find a new tactic or a brilliant commander. They found a crude, experimental system so awkward and unreliable that most soldiers had mocked it before it ever reached the front. It was heavy. It overheated. Its batteries failed. Its field of view was narrow. And yet, when used correctly, it allowed ordinary infantrymen to see what the enemy believed was protected by darkness itself, turning night attacks into fatal mistakes instead of unstoppable threats. And in that moment, the Japanese army understood why their most effective weapon had suddenly stopped working, not because the night had changed, but because, for the first time in history, someone was watching it. The first American troops landed on Okinawa believing the worst danger would come at dawn. They were wrong. The daylight was brutal, but predictable. Artillery ruled the open ground. Airstrikes crushed anything that tried to move in formation. If the Japanese stood and fought in the sun, they died quickly. Everyone on both sides understood that. So the Japanese did not fight in daylight. They waited. Night fell early on Okinawa, heavy and wet, swallowing the ridgelines and the broken coral fields. When the sun disappeared, the battlefield changed character. Distances collapsed, shapes dissolved. Orders became whispers. Every rustle in the grass sounded like a man crawling closer. And crawling was exactly what they did. Japanese infiltration teams moved in small groups, 10 men, sometimes fewer. They did not charge. They did not shout. They slid through drainage ditches, shell holes, folds in the terrain that American maps barely showed. They carried grenades, satchel charges, bayonets. Some carried nothing but a rifle and patience. Their objective was simple: get inside the American perimeter. Once inside, the rules no longer mattered. A grenade into a foxhole, a bayonet in the dark. A machine gun crew wiped out before anyone realized they were under attack. Then silence again. The Americans fired thousands of rounds into that silence. Most of them hit nothing. Flares were supposed to solve the problem. They burst overhead, flooding the ground with harsh white light, turning night into a frozen photograph. For 20 seconds, every man could see. Then the flare burned out. And when it did, every American who had looked up was blind. Eyes take time to recover. 30 seconds, sometimes more. In those seconds, Japanese infiltrators moved. They changed direction. They closed distance. They slipped past positions that had just been illuminated, knowing the defenders were now staring into blackness even deeper than before. Machine guns roared anyway, firing at sounds, at guesses, at fear. Barrels overheated. Belts ran dry. Men fired because doing nothing felt worse. By the third night, exhaustion set in. Soldiers stopped trusting the dark. They stopped trusting silence. Some fired at shadows that turned out to be nothing. Others froze, convinced movement was coming where there was none. Medics began treating men who weren't wounded but could no longer function, hands shaking, eyes bloodshot, minds locked in constant alert. The Japanese understood this too. Night was not just cover, it was pressure. Each successful infiltration multiplied the effect of the next. Even when an attack failed, it forced the Americans to stay awake, to listen, to imagine. By dawn, entire platoons were operating on hours or minutes of sleep. They fought the day tired and faced the night already broken. This was not a tactical problem. It was a systemic one. American firepower had solved many things in the Pacific. Darkness was not one of them. Every solution created a new vulnerability. More flares meant more blindness. More firing meant more exhaustion. More noise meant more confusion about where the enemy actually was. The enemy, meanwhile, learned quickly. They mapped American habits. Which units fired too early? Which sectors relied too heavily on illumination? Which foxholes went quiet after midnight? They did not need to win the night outright. They only needed to survive it better than the men defending against them. By early April 1945, commanders on Okinawa faced an uncomfortable truth. They were not losing ground. They were losing control. Reports from the front lines described the same pattern again and again. Small infiltration teams slipping through supposedly secure sectors. Casualties inflicted without warning. Units holding their positions but at a growing psychological cost that no map could show. The Americans could destroy Japanese positions by day. At night, the Japanese came anyway, and no one had an answer. There was no new doctrine to issue, no additional artillery that could solve a problem measured in inches and seconds, no amount of courage that could make a man see what the darkness refused to reveal. The night belonged to the attacker because it always had, until someone questioned that assumption. Not with a bold speech, not with a clever maneuver, but with a quiet, deeply unpopular idea that suggested the problem was not Japanese tactics at all, but human vision itself. If darkness worked because men could not see, then the solution was not to light the battlefield. It was to stop relying on the human eye. That idea did not sound heroic. It did not promise glory. It came with cables, batteries, fragile components, and training manuals no one wanted to read in a war already filled with enough complications. Most soldiers who heard about it laughed. Some called it useless. Some called it dangerous. Some called it a waste of time. But on Okinawa, as the nights grew longer and the infiltrations grew bolder, laughter became a luxury no one could afford. Because every night the darkness went unchallenged, it took something with it. A life. A unit's confidence. Another hour of sleep that would never come back. And soon, someone was going to try to take the night away. The idea didn't come from desperation on Okinawa. It came from embarrassment years earlier. American engineers had watched report after report arrive from the Pacific describing the same problem. Units overwhelmed at night, not by numbers, but by invisibility. Every solution treated darkness as something to be removed, burn it away with flares, drown it in fire, scare it into retreat. None of that worked. So instead of asking how to light the battlefield, a small group of engineers asked a different question. What if the battlefield didn't need light at all? The concept was inelegant, almost insulting in its simplicity. Mount a spotlight that emitted light no human eye could see. Pair it with a scope that could convert that invisible light into something usable. Give the soldier the ability to see without announcing that he was seeing anything at all. On paper, it looked promising. In practice, it looked ridiculous. The system was heavy, obscenely heavy by infantry standards. The rifle alone was manageable, but once the scope, infrared spotlight, cables, and battery pack were added, the weapon nearly doubled in weight. The battery, built from lead-acid cells, no different from those used in automobiles, was strapped to the operator's back like a burden from another trade entirely. It hummed. It overheated. It drained power quickly. Its field of view was so narrow it felt like looking through a keyhole. To most soldiers, it didn't look like the future of warfare. It looked like a liability. The jokes spread faster than the training manuals. A car battery with a trigger. Science fiction nonsense. Something for engineers, not infantry. Men who had survived Guadalcanal and Peleliu had little patience for fragile devices that required careful handling in a war fought with mud, rain, and blood. And yet, the Army kept pushing the program forward. Quietly. The system was never meant for mass issue. It wasn't designed to replace standard rifles or change infantry doctrine overnight. It was an experiment, an attempt to tilt one specific condition of battle just enough to matter. A handful of systems were built. Fewer were deployed. Even fewer were issued to frontline units. Those who received them were not chosen for heroism. They were chosen for discipline. The training reflected that. No dramatic firing exercises, no emphasis on kill counts. Operators learned battery management before marksmanship. They practiced switching power packs in the dark until their hands memorized the sequence. They learned to scan slowly, deliberately, because moving too fast through the narrow field of view meant missing everything. Most importantly, they learned restraint. The system was not built for continuous use. 20 minutes of operation could push the spotlight into dangerous heat levels. Condensation could form inside sealed components. If the operator panicked, left the system on too long, scanned too aggressively, the advantage disappeared. This was not a weapon that rewarded instinct. It punished it. That alone made it unpopular. Infantrymen trusted things that worked immediately. Rifles fired when you pulled the trigger. Grenades exploded when you threw them. This system required patience, planning, and an acceptance that it might fail at the worst possible moment. Many officers questioned whether it belonged anywhere near the front. But Okinawa did not care about opinions. By the time the first systems arrived, night infiltration had already proven itself too effective to ignore. Units were losing men without warning. Morale was eroding in ways commanders could not quantify but could not deny. So the experimental systems were issued not with fanfare, but with caution. No announcements. No promises. No guarantees. Operators were told only this: if it worked, it might save lives. If it didn't, no one would be surprised. The irony was impossible to miss. The most technologically advanced solution to the problem of darkness was handed to ordinary soldiers with no expectation of recognition. The system was so sensitive, so unusual, that its users were warned not to discuss it even with men in neighboring foxholes. Secrecy wasn't about protecting the enemy from knowledge. It was about protecting the program from disbelief. Because if it failed, and many assumed it would fail quietly. Another idea discarded. Another footnote in a war already filled with abandoned experiments. But if it worked, it wouldn't announce itself with explosions or sweeping offensives. It wouldn't change the front lines. It wouldn't show up on maps. It would reveal itself in a far subtler way. The enemy would stop coming. And on Okinawa, with the darkness still winning and the nights growing deadlier, that possibility, however unlikely, was enough. The system was issued. The batteries were charged. The operators took their positions. And the night prepared to do what it had always done. It just didn't know someone was finally watching it. The night did not announce that anything had changed. There was no sudden silence, no dramatic signal, no shift in the way the wind moved through the grass. Okinawa, after sunset, looked exactly as it had the nights before, humid, heavy, and indifferent. The Japanese infiltration teams moved as they always had. Small groups slipped out from cover, spacing themselves carefully, advancing in staggered lines. They avoided obvious paths. They stayed low. They listened more than they looked, because looking had never helped in total darkness. From their perspective, nothing suggested danger. No flares burned overhead. No machine guns opened fire. No sudden noise betrayed American alertness. That absence of reaction was familiar. It meant the defenders were tired. It meant the night was working. What the infiltrators could not see was that, in a few scattered sectors along the American line, something had changed in a way that left no visible trace. No extra men. No new fortifications. Just a handful of soldiers sitting still, waiting, watching in a way no one had ever watched the night before. When the system was activated, it did not flood the battlefield with light. It did not alter the darkness for anyone except the man looking through the scope. The world inside the glass emerged in shades of green. Vegetation appeared first, static, uneven, unreal. Rocks reflected faintly. The ground resolved into texture instead of void. Movement was no longer guessed at. It was seen. A shape crawled forward. Not a blur, not a sound, a body. Arms pulling, legs pushing, rifle slung across a back that believed itself invisible. The operator did not rush. He had been trained not to. He watched the figure move, then stop, then move again. He watched the way the man used the terrain, choosing the same low routes that had defeated American defenses night after night. He saw two more shapes appear behind the first, spaced, carefully, disciplined, patient. To the infiltrators, nothing had changed. They were still ghosts. The first shot broke that illusion, but only for them. There was no muzzle flash bright enough to give away the firing position. No tracer to follow back. Just a sharp sound, then a body collapsing in a way that could not be mistaken. The second man froze. That hesitation was fatal. Another shot, another body down. The third tried to retreat, suddenly aware that something was wrong but unable to understand what. He did not run far. The engagement was over in seconds. What mattered was not how quickly it ended, but how incomprehensible it was to those who witnessed it. Elsewhere along the line, similar moments unfolded. Men advanced through darkness that had protected generations of soldiers before them. They moved carefully, exactly as Doctrine prescribed, and then they fell one by one without warning, without visible cause. Those who survived did not see a superior enemy. They saw nothing at all. From the Japanese perspective, this was the worst possible outcome. Night attacks relied not only on concealment, but on certainty. Certainty that the enemy could not see. Certainty that silence meant safety. Certainty that if something went wrong, it would go wrong loudly. This time, it did not. Bodies appeared where no fire had come from. Groups halted mid-advance, unsure whether to push forward or pull back. Voices whispered urgently in the dark as men tried to understand what kind of weapon could kill without revealing itself. Some units attempted to probe. Others stopped entirely, waiting for orders that never came. Every instinct told them the night should still belong to them. It no longer did. For the American operators, the experience was no less unsettling. Training had not prepared them for the psychological weight of what they were doing. Seeing clearly while everyone else remained blind created a strange disconnect. The battlefield no longer felt chaotic. It felt exposed, vulnerable, almost intimate. Targets were no longer shapes imagined in fear. They were men. The system demanded calm. Panic wasted battery life. Hesitation allowed the enemy to close distance. Every decision carried consequences measured not in heroics, but in seconds of visibility. And always, there was the awareness that this advantage could disappear at any moment. The battery could fail. The scope could fog. The narrow field of view could hide something just outside perception. So the operators worked methodically. They engaged when necessary and stayed silent when they could. They let some figures pass rather than risk revealing their presence too early. They learned, in real time, how to think like something between a soldier and a machine. By dawn, the difference was undeniable. In sectors where the system had been used, infiltration attempts had stalled. Attacks that normally reached the perimeter never arrived. In some areas, the night passed without a single close contact. There were no cheers at sunrise. No celebration. Just confusion on both sides of the line. The Americans did not yet understand the full impact of what had happened. The Japanese understood even less. They only knew that something fundamental had shifted, and that the darkness they trusted had betrayed them without explanation. The night had not been defeated by firepower. It had been defeated by observation. And that realization would force both sides to change everything they thought they knew about fighting after sunset. The first night proved the system could work. The second night proved how easily it could fail. There was a dangerous misconception, spreading quietly through the American lines, that seeing in the dark meant owning the dark. The operators learned quickly that this was wrong. The system did not give control. It demanded discipline. Every advantage came with a cost. The battery was always the first concern. Power drained whether shots were fired or not. The scope did not care about tension or patience. It only cared about time. 20 minutes of continuous use was a guideline, not a promise. Push past it, and the system punished carelessness with heat, flicker, and sudden blindness. Operators began to count minutes in their heads. Scan for 30 seconds. Pause. Listen. Scan again. Leaving the system on felt safe until it wasn't. Overheated components distorted the image. Condensation bloomed inside sealed optics. A clear green silhouette could dissolve into static without warning, leaving the operator staring at nothing while believing he was still seeing something. That moment was deadly. So the men adapted. They stopped thinking like riflemen and started thinking like custodians of a fragile advantage. Engagements became shorter. Observation replaced aggression. The system was activated only when something might be there, not to search endlessly, but to confirm. The narrow field of view forced another change. Looking through the scope was like peering down a tunnel. Movement outside that tunnel did not exist until it entered the frame. Operators learned to scan slowly, deliberately, resisting the urge to sweep too fast and miss everything. Speed felt wrong. Precision felt safer. They adjusted their positions accordingly. Elevated ground became critical not for dominance, but for overlap. Two operators, covering adjacent sectors, could compensate for each other's blind spots. One watched while the other rested his system. Batteries were rotated, timers were shared. This was not improvisation. It was procedure forming under pressure. The Japanese noticed the change before the Americans did. Infiltration teams that had once moved confidently along predictable routes began to hesitate. Drainage ditches, tree lines, and folds in the terrain paths that had guaranteed concealment started producing casualties. Men died where they should have been safest. So the Japanese adapted. They abandoned the obvious. They chose thicker vegetation, rougher coral ground, places that forced slower movement but disrupted the narrow view of the scopes. They split into smaller elements, hoping to stretch the defender's attention. They crawled where crawling made no sense because it was unpredictable. And again, the system answered only if the operator knew how to use it. Elevation mattered more than aggression. A position 40 yards behind the main line often provided better angles than a forward foxhole. From there, operators could watch approaches without exposing themselves to blind return fire. But even that came with risk. Firing revealed patterns, not location, but behavior. After each engagement, operators went quiet. They changed positions when possible. They resisted the temptation to hunt. The goal was not kills. The goal was denial. Battery swaps became rituals performed by touch alone. Disconnect, connect, secure. 15 seconds that felt longer than any firefight. Eyes stayed on the darkness while hands worked behind the back, trusting muscle memory over sight. Sometimes, the system betrayed them anyway. Humidity crept in, heat built up, the image flickered, then vanished. In those moments, the operators were no better than anyone else, blind, exposed, aware that the enemy did not know why the advantage had disappeared, only that it might have. So the system was cycled, on, off, on again, short bursts of vision, controlled exposure. What emerged over the following nights was not a miracle weapon, but a method. Men learned when not to look, when to wait, when to let movement pass rather than engage too early. The system rewarded patience and punished bravado. It did not care how brave the operator felt. It only cared whether he followed its limits. This changed the rhythm of the night. Where chaos had once ruled, there was now structure. Where exhaustion had spread unchecked, there were now rotations. Operators rested while others watched. The night was broken into manageable segments rather than endured as a single, endless threat. The Japanese felt this shift even when they could not explain it. Advances slowed. Reconnaissance teams failed to return. Infiltration attempts began to stall farther from the perimeter. The darkness still hid them, but it no longer protected them. Most importantly, The system began to teach its operators something the Army had never formally taught before. That survival at night was not about courage. It was about restraint. The men using the system did not feel like heroes. They felt like technicians maintaining a fragile edge that could vanish with a single mistake. Every successful night reinforced the same lesson. The darkness could be defeated, but only by those willing to treat it like a system, not an enemy. The Japanese were adapting. The Americans were learning. And somewhere between those two processes, the rules of night combat were being rewritten quietly, methodically, without anyone fully realizing it yet. The Japanese did not need to understand the technology to understand the effect. Something had changed in the night. Routes that had been safe were no longer safe. Silence no longer meant invisibility. So they adapted the only way experienced soldiers ever do, by testing the edges. The first change was subtle. Infiltration teams stopped using the terrain features that had once guaranteed concealment. Drainage ditches went unused. Tree lines were approached cautiously, then bypassed entirely. Instead, men began moving through the worst ground available: thick vegetation, broken coral, places that tore at uniforms and slowed progress to a crawl. The logic was simple. If the Americans were seeing through the darkness, then clutter the darkness. Force their vision to fail. Force their narrow view to miss something. It worked sometimes. Operators, scanning through scopes, saw less. Shapes blended into chaotic textures. Movement became harder to isolate. The system still functioned, but the margin for error shrank. Targets appeared later, closer, with less time to react. The Japanese pressed that advantage. Groups split into pairs. Pairs split into individuals. Advance routes overlapped and crossed, not to confuse the Americans who still could not be seen, but to stretch their attention thin. Every extra angle meant another place the scope was not looking. And then the weather changed. Fog rolled in from the coast without warning, thick enough to reduce visibility to a few dozen feet. To the naked eye, it was complete blindness. To the infrared system, it was better, but not enough. The range collapsed. What had once been 70 yards became 40, sometimes less. The Japanese recognized the opportunity immediately. They advanced faster, bolder. The fog felt familiar, protective. It gave back what the night had begun to take away. In some sectors, infiltrators pushed close enough to test the perimeter directly, forcing operators to fire sooner than they wanted, closer than the system preferred. A few made it uncomfortably far. Not through brilliance, but through pressure. The system could see, but it could not see everything. In those moments, the operators learned the most dangerous lesson of all. Technology did not remove risk. It only reshaped it. Every advantage created a new vulnerability, and the enemy was learning where those vulnerabilities lived. The next adaptation came at a cost the Americans did not expect. Light. One night, beams flared suddenly in the darkness, handheld flashlights snapping on and off, not to illuminate terrain, but to blind. The light overwhelmed the image converter inside the scope, washing the green world into white static. For a moment, the operator saw nothing. The tactic was crude, but effective. It did not last long. The light revealed the user's position immediately, but it forced a reaction. Systems had to be shut down. Eyes had to adjust. Grenades replaced precision shots. The Japanese were no longer trying to remain invisible. They were trying to disrupt the invisible. Each counter forced the Americans to respond not with new equipment, but with judgment. When to engage, when to wait, when to shut down the system and let the night return to what it had always been. The most dangerous engagements were no longer the quiet ones. They were the moments when the system's advantage narrowed just enough to make decisions uncertain. Groups advanced aggressively, firing blindly, hoping to provoke a response that would reveal positions. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness in brief bursts, each one a potential guide for return fire, but also a gamble. Fire too often, and you became visible. Fire too little, and the enemy closed distance. Operators learned to watch for those flashes instead of bodies. Light, even for a fraction of a second, betrayed shape and location. A rifle crack in the dark became an opportunity, not a target, an opening. The Japanese adapted again. They fired less. They moved more. They waited for moments when fog, terrain, or exhaustion might tip the balance. But the fundamental problem remained. They were reacting. For the first time in the campaign, Japanese night operations were no longer dictating the tempo. They were probing, testing, adjusting, trying to rediscover an advantage that had once been absolute. And that effort carried its own cost. Hesitation replaced confidence. Units advanced more slowly. Some infiltrations were called off entirely. Others stalled before reaching effective range. Attacks that once felt inevitable now felt uncertain. The darkness was still there, but it no longer belonged to them. For the American operators, the nights became harder, not easier. Success demanded constant attention. Fatigue accumulated anyway. Batteries still failed. Fog still reduced range. The system did not promise safety. It only offered a chance. And that chance was enough to force the enemy into choices they had never had to make before. Advance and risk being seen. Hold back and lose momentum. Probe blindly and reveal yourself. None of those options favored the attacker. By adapting, the Japanese confirmed what the operators were beginning to understand. This was no longer a contest of courage or numbers. It was a contest of systems, and the side that learned faster would own the night, if only temporarily. The enemy had adapted. Now the consequences would begin to show. For the first time since landing on Okinawa, American commanders could measure what had changed. Not in captured ground, not in destroyed positions, but in something far more revealing, the absence of losses. Night after night, reports came in that did not fit previous patterns. Sectors that had endured constant infiltration attempts were suddenly quiet. Patrols that normally reported contact after midnight reported nothing at all. Foxholes that had been reinforced out of fear went untouched. At first, the numbers didn't make sense. Japanese casualties from small arms fire during night operations spiked sharply but only in certain areas. American casualties from infiltration dropped just as sharply but again, only in those same sectors. When analysts overlaid the reports, the pattern emerged. The areas experiencing the greatest reduction in American losses were the ones covered by a very small number of men, not companies, not platoons, individuals, men operating the experimental system. They represented a fraction of the division's strength, barely noticeable on a roster, but their effect was impossible to ignore. Where they operated, infiltration attempts fell apart before reaching the perimeter. Where they were absent, the old patterns still appeared. The implication was unsettling. This was not a marginal improvement. It was not incremental progress. It was disproportionate impact. A handful of operators were shaping the behavior of enemy units hundreds of yards away, without the enemy ever seeing them. The numbers told the story more clearly than any eyewitness account. Nighttime small arms casualties inflicted on Japanese forces clustered heavily around sectors covered by the system. American losses from infiltration in those same sectors dropped to a fraction of what had been recorded earlier in the campaign. But the most important statistic wasn't how many enemy soldiers were killed. It was how many never attacked at all. Infiltration attempts declined, not gradually, but abruptly. Units that had previously probed night after night simply stopped appearing. Reconnaissance teams failed to advance. Assault elements hesitated, then withdrew before committing. Commanders on the Japanese side did not need to understand why this was happening. They only needed to accept that it was. The night, once their greatest advantage, had become unpredictable. Routes that worked yesterday failed today. Timing no longer guaranteed safety. Darkness no longer erased observation. That uncertainty spread faster than casualties ever could. Orders changed. Night operations were limited. Infiltration was restricted to adverse weather conditions. Units were instructed to prioritize concealment in caves and underground positions rather than movement across open ground after sunset. The doctrine that had defined Japanese night fighting across the Pacific began to collapse, not because it was flawed, but because it no longer functioned under new conditions. This was the moment the system crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer an experiment. It was shaping enemy behavior. The Americans did not celebrate this shift. There were no announcements, no tactical manuals rewritten overnight. The operators themselves barely understood the scale of what they were influencing. They continued their routines: scan, wait, engage, conserve power, unaware that entire enemy units were altering plans because of them. From the outside, it looked like quiet. From the inside, it was control. This is how doctrine actually breaks, not with dramatic defeats, but with repeated, inexplicable failure. When commanders can no longer predict outcomes, they stop taking risks. When risk disappears, initiative dies with it. By forcing the enemy to question the night itself, the system achieved something far beyond its intended role. It did not simply reduce casualties, it removed confidence. And confidence is the true currency of offensive action. For the first time on Okinawa, Japanese night attacks were no longer assumed to be effective. They became conditional, situational, avoided when possible. The darkness still existed, but it no longer belonged to them. What no one could yet see was the broader implication. If a small number of men, using fragile equipment under extreme conditions, could reshape how an enemy fought at night, then darkness, as a concept, was no longer a reliable weapon. It had been neutralized, not everywhere, not permanently, but decisively enough to change behavior. That realization would ripple outward, far beyond Okinawa, into future wars and future doctrines. But in that moment, it manifested in a simpler way. The nights grew quieter, not because the enemy had disappeared, but because attacking in the dark had finally become too dangerous to justify. And when the night stops fighting back, the war itself begins to change. The change did not happen all at once. There was no single night when the battlefield suddenly fell silent. No moment when commanders could point to a map and say, "This is where it ended." Instead, the darkness simply began to lose its aggression. Japanese units still moved after sunset, but differently. What had once been confident, deliberate infiltration became cautious repositioning. Men stayed closer to cover. Routes shortened. The distance between intention and action widened. In some sectors, nothing happened at all. American sentries noticed it first. Hours passed without contact, no probing fire, no crawling shapes, no sudden explosions inside the wire. Men who had learned to dread the hours after midnight found themselves staring into darkness that did nothing. At first, they didn't trust it. Silence had always been a trick. But night after night, the pattern held. The Japanese were no longer testing the perimeter. They were withdrawing from it. Captured documents and intercepted orders later confirmed what frontline units already suspected. Japanese commanders had accepted a new reality. Moving across open ground after dark no longer guaranteed concealment. In some places, it almost guaranteed death. So, the orders changed. Night infiltration was restricted. Large-scale movement after sunset was discouraged except under conditions that degraded visibility for everyone. Heavy rain, dense fog, storms that punished both sides equally. Units were told to prioritize static defense, to hold ground from caves, tunnels, and underground complexes where observation, visible or invisible, could not reach. The night was no longer a weapon. It was a risk. This shift carried consequences far beyond reduced infiltration attempts. Japanese forces had relied on night operations to offset American superiority in firepower and logistics. Without that advantage, their tactical options narrowed dramatically. Daylight belonged to the Americans. Night no longer belonged to anyone. For the U.S., forces. The effect was immediate and profound. Sleep returned, not fully, not easily, but enough. Units that had been locked in constant alert began rotating watches with less fear. Exhaustion eased. Decision-making improved. Daytime operations benefited from something no reinforcement could deliver: rested minds. The system did not eliminate danger. It did not end the fighting, but it changed the rhythm of the war. And rhythm matters. Wars are not won solely by victories. They are won by sustainability, by which side can continue operating effectively when conditions grind everything down. By removing the enemy's ability to dominate the night, the Americans reclaimed a portion of control they had never fully possessed before. The operators themselves felt the change in an unexpected way. Their nights grew quieter but more tense. When the enemy stopped coming, the responsibility felt heavier, not lighter. Every silence raised new questions. Was the system deterring movement, or were attacks simply being delayed? Was this adaptation permanent, or just temporary restraint? They stayed vigilant. The darkness was no longer hostile, but it was never friendly. In many ways, this was the most dangerous phase. Complacency could undo everything. Batteries were still checked. Scopes were still cycled. Observation continued, even when nothing moved. Because the operators understood something the enemy had learned the hard way. The absence of action was the proof of effectiveness. The greatest success of the system was not measured in engagements, but in the attacks that never happened, the foxholes that were never entered, the grenades that were never thrown. By forcing the Japanese into static defense, the system reshaped the battlefield itself. The fight moved underground. Caves replaced infiltration routes. Fortified positions replaced movement. The war did not become easier. It became different. And in that difference lay a quiet truth that would echo through future conflicts. Controlling visibility controls initiative. When one side can observe without being seen, the other side must surrender freedom of movement or accept unacceptable losses. On Okinawa, the Japanese chose to surrender movement. The night, once a shield, had become a liability. And somewhere in the darkness, unseen and largely unacknowledged, a small number of men continued to watch, maintaining an advantage that no one could afford to ignore anymore. The darkness had not disappeared, but it had stopped fighting back. The men who operated the system were never meant to be seen. That was not a metaphor. It was policy. From the beginning, the program lived in a strange space between urgency and secrecy. The technology was experimental, the deployment limited, and the consequences, if captured or understood by the enemy, considered unacceptable. Operators were instructed not to discuss the system with anyone outside a narrow chain of command. Not with other platoons. Not with replacements. Sometimes not even with the men in the next foxhole. They fought alongside soldiers who had no idea why certain sectors stayed quiet at night. This isolation shaped everything. There were no stories passed down the line, no rumors of heroics, no shared sense of accomplishment. The men who watched the night could not explain why they stayed awake when others slept, or why their rifles looked wrong, or why cables ran under their jackets into battery packs no one else carried. Secrecy stripped the work of recognition. There were no medals for preventing attacks, no citations for casualties that never happened. The operators did not charge enemy positions or raise flags. They sat in place for hours, staring into a green-tinted world that only existed for them, waiting for something to move. When nothing happened, they said nothing. Even within official records, the men remained indistinct. After-action reports spoke of systems and coverage, not names. The impact was quantified, but the individuals were interchangeable on paper operators, not soldiers. This was not accidental. The Army did not yet know what it had created. The system was effective, but fragile. The doctrine around it was incomplete. Commanders feared that drawing attention to its success would invite scrutiny, pressure for wider deployment, or demands the technology could not yet meet. So the program remained quiet. When the fighting shifted away from night infiltration, the operators were reassigned. Their equipment followed them, or didn't. In some cases, systems were withdrawn entirely, replaced by conventional roles as if nothing unusual had occurred. There were no debriefings meant for public memory, no interviews recorded, no photographs staged. The men returned to being infantrymen. After the war, the silence deepened. Most of the systems were destroyed deliberately, cut apart, rendered unusable. Not because they had failed, but because they had worked too well. The technology was still ahead of its time, and the Army did not want it studied, copied, or misused. With the equipment gone, the operators vanished with it. Names disappeared from discussions. The work became abstract, an early example of night vision development, a stepping stone in technical papers. The human element was stripped away, replaced by diagrams and specifications. Some operators survived the war, some did not. For many, even basic details where they lived afterward, what they did, whether they spoke about their experience at all, were never recorded. Their anonymity was complete. This absence of narrative is why their story matters. Not because they were extraordinary individuals, but because they represent a kind of warfare that rarely leaves footprints. A kind of contribution that saves lives by preventing moments that would otherwise be remembered. No one remembers the battle that didn't happen. No one builds monuments to nights that stayed quiet. And yet, those nights shaped the campaign as surely as any assault. The operators did not see themselves as pioneers. They did not frame their work as revolutionary. They were solving a problem that existed in front of them, using a tool that demanded patience rather than courage. They did not defeat the enemy directly. They denied him opportunity. That distinction matters. In modern warfare, the most powerful changes often come not from overwhelming force, but from removing options. When an enemy can no longer move freely, when their best tactics no longer function, the battlefield contracts around them. That contraction began in the dark, with men who could not speak about what they were doing even to each other. Their reward was survival. Their legacy was invisibility. They left no memoirs. They gave no interviews. They became footnotes if they appeared at all. And yet, the war they fought would outlast them. Because the idea they proved that darkness could be observed, measured, and denied would not stay secret forever. It would resurface in new forms, under new names, carried by new generations of soldiers who never knew where it began. The men who operated the system on Okinawa did not change history loudly. They changed it quietly, and then they disappeared into it. When the fighting on Okinawa began to shift underground, the system's role faded with it. Not because it had failed, but because the battlefield it was designed to dominate no longer existed. Japanese forces withdrew into caves, tunnels, and hardened positions where visibility, infrared or otherwise, meant nothing. The night above ground grew quieter, not because the enemy was gone, but because movement itself had become too costly. For the operators, this was the beginning of the end. The system was used less frequently. Batteries were conserved. Scopes stayed dark for entire nights at a time. The work that had once demanded constant vigilance became intermittent, then rare. Eventually, some operators went days without activating their equipment at all. This should have felt like victory. It didn't. The system had never been about triumph. It had been about necessity. When that necessity vanished, so did the justification for its presence. Commanders began reallocating resources. Units were reorganized. The experimental quietly returned to being expendable. Then, the war moved on. Plans were drawn for an invasion of mainland Japan, an operation that would dwarf everything that had come before it. In preparation, the Army expanded its thinking about night combat. The lessons from Okinawa were noted, analyzed, and partially understood. There were plans to build more systems. Better systems. Systems with longer range, improved reliability, and simpler operation. Training programs were outlined, production numbers were discussed. And then, abruptly, none of it mattered. Japan surrendered. The invasion was canceled. The urgency evaporated overnight. What had been cutting edge in April 1945 became surplus by August. With no immediate war to justify its existence, the system entered an uncomfortable phase. It was too advanced to ignore, too fragile to issue widely, and too secret to release into civilian or Allied hands. So the Army made a decision. Most of the systems were destroyed. Not stored, not mothballed, destroyed. Scopes were removed and cut apart, cables severed, components dismantled beyond repair. The technology was deliberately erased, its physical form reduced to scrap so that no adversary or even future analyst could easily reconstruct it. It was an ending that matched the system's entire life. Quiet, deliberate, final. But technology rarely disappears completely. While the hardware vanished, the idea survived. Engineers carried the lessons forward. The realization that night did not have to be surrendered, that visibility could be engineered rather than hoped for, became foundational. Future systems abandoned active illumination in favor of passive amplification. Image intensifiers replaced infrared spotlights. Range increased, reliability improved. By the time of the Korean War, successors to the original system were already in use. In Vietnam, night vision became standard rather than experimental. By the late 20th century, fighting in the dark without some form of enhanced vision became unthinkable. Modern armies now treat the night not as an obstacle, but as a domain. That transformation began quietly, with a system that no longer exists, and men who were never meant to be remembered. The irony is hard to miss. One of the most important shifts in modern warfare left almost no physical trace of its origin. No preserved prototypes, no famous inventors, no celebrated operators. Just a brief window in which the darkness failed. And then the weapon that made it happen was erased by the very institution it had served, because its purpose had been fulfilled. The night was no longer sacred. It could be taken away. The system disappeared. The idea did not. And that idea would return, again and again, wherever soldiers needed to move, fight, and survive after the sun went down. Not as a miracle, not as a secret, but as a standard. A quiet inheritance from a war fought in silence by men whose greatest success ensured they would never be noticed. When the fighting on Okinawa finally ended, there were no ceremonies for the knights. No formations honoring the hours spent listening in the dark. No medals awarded for attacks that never came. The official histories recorded the battles, the casualties, the advances measured in yards and days. They did not record the absence. And yet, for many of the men who survived the campaign, it was the quiet that stayed with them. The nights that followed, April no longer carried the same tension. The darkness still fell, heavy and absolute, but it no longer pressed inward. Men slept in fragments instead of minutes. Watches rotated without the constant expectation of sudden violence. The war remained brutal, but it had lost one of its most intimate weapons. The night was no longer hunting them. For the operators, the transition was strange. The work that had defined their nights vanished without acknowledgement. The system that had demanded such care and restraint was taken away, dismantled, or simply left behind. They returned to ordinary roles, carrying with them an experience they were never meant to explain. Some tried to describe it later and found there were no words. How do you explain watching an enemy who cannot see you, and realizing that your greatest achievement is making sure nothing happens? History prefers moments it can point to. This was not one of them. There was no single engagement that proved the system's worth. No decisive battle that turned the campaign. The impact revealed itself only in patterns declining, attacks, changing orders, a shift in enemy behavior that unfolded quietly across reports and recollections. It was warfare conducted in negative space. The success was not the enemy killed, but the enemy deterred. Not ground gained, but ground never contested. Not heroism displayed, but danger removed before it could manifest. Those outcomes rarely earn recognition. The men who operated the system did not think of themselves as pioneers. They did not see their work as revolutionary. They were doing what soldiers have always done, adapting to survive. What made their contribution different was not bravery, but perception. They lived through the moment when darkness lost its monopoly, when night ceased to be a sanctuary for movement and became just another condition to be managed. That shift would echo through every conflict that followed. Today, soldiers move confidently after sunset, supported by devices that trace their lineage directly back to those early experiments. Modern night vision is lighter, clearer, more reliable, but the principle remains unchanged. See without being seen. Observe without announcing. Deny the enemy the confidence of invisibility. That principle was not born in a laboratory alone. It was proven in foxholes, under humidity and stress, by men who learned how to treat vision as a system rather than a sense. Their names did not carry forward with the technology, but their impact did. The war they fought did not look dramatic from the outside. There were no sweeping maneuvers, no charges into fire. Just long hours of stillness, broken occasionally by decisive action, followed by more silence. They fought a war the enemy could not see. They won it one night at a time, not by overpowering the darkness, but by understanding it. And when the war ended, they left behind no monuments, no famous stories, no place in popular memory, only a world in which the night would never again belong to just one side. If these forgotten battles in the dark deserve to be remembered, leave a comment. Not for the numbers, not for the technology, but for the men who proved that sometimes the most important victories are the ones no one ever notices. If stories like this matter to you, stories where wars are changed quietly by people history forgot, then stay with us. We don't tell these stories for spectacle. We tell them because silence erased them. Every week, we uncover battles that never made headlines, systems that worked too well to be remembered, and ordinary people whose impact was measured in lives that were never lost. If you don't want these stories to disappear again, subscribe. Not for notifications, not for algorithms, but so the next forgotten war story doesn't stay buried.